without further hesitation, let's begin. And welcome to our event, Feminist and LGBTI Movements, Uniting is Our Strength. LGBTI rights defenders on building bridges to confront crisis. The fight for LGBTIQ plus human rights and the fight to advance gender equality are intrinsically linked. And yet anti-trans violence and hate increase day by day. And trans and non-binary people have been targeted specifically by both anti-rights and anti-gender actors that seek to revert gender equality gains. This session is being sponsored by state co-sponsors from the Netherlands and Argentina, which we thank. And it has been organized by APTN, AWID, COC, CREA, GATE, ILGA World, IPPF, Outright Action International, RFSL, and TGU. Thank you for being with us today. It is an honor for us to have the participation of Ambassador Bahia Tassib, who will share some opening remarks with us. Dr. Bahia currently serves as the Dutch Human Rights Ambassador. In this capacity, she promotes human rights around the world on behalf of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. She carries out bilateral missions and attends multilateral meetings. She also works to boost dialogue with society on human rights in the Netherlands and abroad. Her previous roles include Dutch Ambassador to the State of Qatar, the Minister of Foreign Affairs Special Envoy for UN Affairs, and Private Secretary to Her Majesty the Queen. Ambassador Tassib holds a master's degree and a PhD in law. She studied law at Utrecht University School of Law and the University of Michigan Law School. Ambassador, please.
Thank you, dear Erica, for giving me the floor. So happy to be here. Your Excellencies, distinguished participants, I'm greatly honored for the opportunity to deliver opening remarks on behalf of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. I'd like to thank the organizers for their tireless work to advance LGBTI, women's and girls' rights around the world. And a big thank you to Argentina for co-sponsoring this event with us. We greatly appreciate our ongoing partnership in the Equal Rights Coalition and the Generation Equality Action Coalitions. And of course, a warm welcome to all participants. Thank you for being here. I personally believe that it's incredibly important to share and listen to the experiences of LGBTI, women's and girls' rights defenders in all their diversity. Their stories matter and offer insight into their commonalities and the intersectional challenges they face. Inspired by the stories of the activists I have met, I will highlight two reasons why I believe that enhanced cooperation between feminist and LGBTI movement maximizes impact. Let me start by saying that through my encounters with LGBTI and women activists, I became more aware about some special characteristics they all have in common. Personal characteristics that I deeply admire about them. It's their courage and resilience to overcome barriers. They all show tremendous strength and determination despite violence and threats perpetrated by the same or similar patriarchal standards. A second common denominator that unites the feminist and LGBTI movements is their unstoppable drive and ambition for equal rights. It's also significant that their ambitions overlap, as we are starting to see how the equal rights for women and girls interconnects with the equal rights for LGBTI persons. There's now more awareness that discrimination against women based on sex and gender is often inextricably linked with and compounded by other factors that affect women, such as being lesbian, bisexual, or a transgender person. Victor Madrigal, the independent expert on SARGI, and very happy he's here with us. Victor, good to see you again. So Victor clearly captures this all so well in his report. He notes, for example, and I quote, feminist struggle and the fight to live free from violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity are deeply intertwined, and they reinforce each other, unquote. In closing, despite our many differences, we're all equal, and it's only human that we be treated in that way. I very much look forward to listening to the experiences and expertise of the wonderful speakers on increasing synergy between the LGBTI and feminist movements. Unity is strength. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for those opening remarks and highlighting the importance of listening to the community. I was very struck by your nice words about maximizing impact and how identifying our commonalities and building on them is something that unites us in strength. Thank you very much. I would like to introduce our first panelist, Victor Madrigal Borloz, a Costa Rican jurist, is a senior visiting researcher at the Harvard Law School Human Rights Program. Victor served as the Secretary General of the International Rehabilitation Council for Torture Victims, a global network of over 150 rehabilitation centers with the vision of full enjoyment of the right to rehabilitation for all victims of torture and ill treatment. A member of the UN Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture from 2013 to 2016, Mr. Madrigal Borloz was rapporteur on reprisals and oversaw a draft policy on the torture and ill treatment of LGBTI persons. In late 2017, the United Nations Human Rights Council appointed Mr. Madrigal Borloz as UN independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity for a 3-year period starting on 1st January 2018. In this capacity, he assesses the implementation of international human rights law, raises awareness, engages in dialogue with all relevant stakeholders, and provides advisory services, technical assistance, capacity building to help address violence and discrimination against persons on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. Victor, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. The mandate recently published a report, and what we would like is if you can highlight some of those findings and recommendations and how to move forward.
Thank you very much, Erika, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. It's a wonderful, wonderful privilege to be amongst you today. Excellencies, distinguished persons, and in particular, the women of the panel. Bahia, Erika, Gita, Gloria, Ivana, and Julia. I have worked with all of you, and I want you to know how much of a privilege it is for me to be sitting amongst you. We have seen in recent years significant backlash against the incorporation of gender theory in international human rights law. We have seen also the emergence of narratives that seek to separate human rights-based approaches on sexual orientations from those of gender identity, seeking to exclude trans and gender diverse persons from the protection derived from the implementation of gender theory, and to challenge the notion that recognition of gender identity ought to be based on self-identification. It is of deep concern to the mandate that some of these arguments that garner public attention are plagued with misconception and reinforce stigma and prejudice. I recognized in the existence of those arguments and in public discussions that are undergoing right now sometimes acrimoniously and violently, the need for the mandate to contribute some elements to that conversation. And that is the reason why I decided to prepare my research this year based on issues relating to gender theory and in particular, its impact also on the recognition and the acknowledgement of gender identity and gender expression under international human rights law. As you know, the report that I presented some days ago before the Human Rights Council, entitled The Law of Inclusion, is the first part of that research, and it represents a study on international human rights law, concluding that gender, gender identity, and gender expression have been incorporated under international human rights law, and that there is a robust body of law supporting the notion that these are protected and in particular categories of concern in anti-discrimination analysis. The second part of the report, and coincidentally, I can share with you that I am actually finalizing the drafting today. The wonderful Catherine Depreux is actually waiting for me, as always, with the deadline ready-made. The second part of that report is actually going to be analyzing the narratives of exclusion that some of you will, of course, acknowledge from public discourse in the last few years. I will present this report to the United Nations General Assembly in October, and it constitutes an analysis of the practices of exclusion that are carried out and result from narratives of resistance to the use of gender theory as a tool to address social inequality. Now, I wanted to address some of the conclusions of my report, but before, Erika, I wanted to leave on record. I know that gender is the quintessential feminist construct, and it is the voices of women, including cis and trans women, heterosexual, lesbian and bisexual women, straight and queer women, white women and women of color, women from the global south and the global north. It was their voices that have been dominant keys in the submissions. Other keys are also persons that are deeply concerned by these narratives and these developments. Trans men, intersex persons, gender diverse persons. All of them have spoken in relation to a process in which I received, as you know, over 500 submissions. I am aware of the unfortunate accident of history that it ought to be a cis gay white men of relative privilege that should actually be formulating these reports. But I do so with great humility and in the hopes that you will all see these voices reflected in the work that I've carried out. Now, in reality, I understand that gender theory, gender-based approaches and intersectionality provide a framework for addressing multiple asymmetries of power, including those that feed violence and discrimination against women. Because it traverses the lives of all individuals who live in gender societies, the study of gender and gender theory is a powerful tool to address the oppression of female or non-normative identities and transform systems of violent masculinity. It also provides a sharp lens for analyzing the root causes of violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity or expression. Because we know that it is departure from what is perceived as gender norms in a particular time and place, what is part of the causes of this violence and this discrimination. And because we know that gender as that deeply entrenched notion or system of preconceptions in society is what actually creates experiences of privilege, inclusion and participation on one hand, and experiences of exclusion and marginalization on the other. At the end, we know that gender contributes to a system of oppression that ends up placing very few of a spiral of privilege and most at the bottom of it. That is, of course, the case for women and persons whose gender identity does not fit squarely within the male-female binary or fits within it in a manner that does not correspond to the preconception attached to the sex assigned at birth. Now, the questioning of the use of this concept in international legal and political fora is pervasive, insistent, and in some cases, violent. It goes from questioning the very use of the concept of gender at all to questioning its consequences in relation to gender identity and gender expression. Unfortunately, its consequences is the generation of significant damages. I have noticed and observed the increase in anti-trans and transphobic discourse in a number of countries. I'm on record as actually creating interlocutions with the Polish state, the Hungarian state, and the Romanian state, in particular with measures adopted under the aegis of enabling legislation for the pandemic, for example. We have seen recent pushback against the Istanbul Convention. Much of the criticism relates to the use of the term gender. We've also seen narratives of gender ideology target comprehensive sexual education and access to information, and being at the base of campaigns promoting the removal of materials relating to gender equality. We also know that these narratives are threatening significantly advances in relation to equality and the protection of LGBT persons around the world. Now, my report concludes on the importance on recognizing that the fight to live free from violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity and the feminist struggle are deeply intertwined and reinforced each other conceptually, socioeconomically, politically, and legally. That states have a duty to recognize every human being's freedom to determine the confines of their existence, including gender identity and expression. And this is the reason why my report has been at the base of my third call for global action, which is for states to establish legal recognition of gender identity based on self-identification. We all know the horrifying violations that stem from the realities of administrative processes that are not simple or accessible, that are not based on the applicant's choice, and that require intrusive or abusive measures such as surgery or hormone treatment. All of this must not be present in the processes of recognition of gender identity. It is important, Erika, that I underline in closing that I believe that this is one of the defining conversations in human rights, in the human rights struggles of our times. I believe that anti-gender and anti-rights discourse has created strange bedfellowships amongst those placed in the extremes of social, economic, cultural, and other social groups. At the end of the day, there seems to be a line that is common to all of their interest, is to defend a system that has been established and that feminism and the LGBT movement have been questioning for the last few decades. I believe that this is the reason why the system is defending itself strongly. I also believe that this is the reason why sexual and reproductive rights, comprehensive sexual education, and bodily autonomy are seen as parts of the targets and conquests of this movement. This is the reason why I believe that this is a quintessential feminist struggle as well. I thank you very much for your invitation to this forum and look forward to learning from you in the remainder of the time together. Thank you very much, Erika.
Thank you very much, Victor. And thank you for expressing again that intertwinedness, that connectivity that we have within the movements. And you know, it goes back again and reinforces what also Ambassador Bahia Tsib mentioned about looking at our commonalities. And I think you mentioned rightly so that we need to refocus. Where do we put our strengths and what kind of system are we defending here? Thank you for talking about the causes of violence and the discrimination. But Victor, thank you very much for your humbleness in of recognizing your position from where you speak. And I think we welcome that very much. Thank you. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions following up in the question and answer section. But I would like to move on to our next speaker. Dr. Ivana Radacic is a member of the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls since 2017. She is a human rights and gender equality expert employed at the Ivo Pilar Institute of Social Sciences in Zagreb. Her research and teaching areas are women's rights, gender equality, human rights, and gender, sexuality, and the law. Her current research is in the area of sex work. Dr. Radacic has published extensively in leading international journals and books, and she has authored the book Sexual Violence, Myths, Stereotypes, and the Legal System. She has taught at various universities in Europe, Central America, Australia, and New Zealand. She also teaches at the Women's Studies Center and the Regional Women's Human Rights Training Institute. Dr. Ivana has also cooperated with international institutions and NGOs on human rights research, training, and litigation, and has been involved with drafting national human rights laws and policies. Dr. Ivana, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Can you please share with us a little bit on the use of the term gender in the feminist theory and how it relates to intersectionality and queer perspective? Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Erika, and good afternoon, morning, or evening to everybody. So yes, I was going to say a few words about the development of the word gender as it starts now. And how the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, of which I am a member, uses the term, how it sees the commonality of our struggles and the partnerships between the movements. As you might all know here, the term gender developed really to challenge the oppression of women. It appeared in the 1970s in the writing of feminism to challenge the dominant position of biological determinism and to really show how inequality is socially constructed. And it defined gender as socially constructed roles, attributes, characteristics of women and men as opposed to biological characteristics. And it pointed to rationality as key in understanding both femininity and masculinity. There were different understandings from the beginning, but the dominant was this social constructionist. And even though the feminism was composed of women from all walks of life, from different nationalities, sexualities, etc. Intersectionality perspective became really important in the 1990s, and it really emphasized how a woman's experience of gender is influenced by her other social identities, so that we cannot talk about gender really in exclusion of all the other relevant characteristics and social identities that a human being has. In the 1990s, also the queer theory became prominent, and it also brought certain contributions to the term gender in a sense of challenging the binary, or what was perceived as the binary understanding in the dominant feminist thought at that time. Some of the normative heterosexual assumptions in the understanding of gender, as well as the clear division between the gender and sex. So in the 1990s, another thing, mid-1990s developed, which was that gender really became an important concept as well in international law. In international law as relates to women's rights. So first the CEDAW in 1992, in that even though the convention uses the term sex, that it looks at the discrimination of women more broadly in the sense of understanding how the differences are socially constructed and looking at the hierarchical system of gender, which really oppresses women. Then in the 1993 at the Vienna conference, the term was used quite frequently, and there were some discussions what it was meant, whether it's only a replacement for women or it's a more radical understanding of the system of oppression, and whether and to what extent it can be used in relation to sexuality, etc. And of course, the term was not of course, but the term was attacked significantly by the Vatican and like-minded states since its introduction in multilateral fora. After that, we have Cairo Declaration and the Beijing, where there's a lot of references to gender, but also lack of definition due to opposition that was exhibited at the time. So we just have this definition that it's according to the common understanding and in reference to male and females. But in the 2000s, we have another development in international human rights law, which is the development of the rights of LGBTIQ, or the use of the concept of SOGI. And so there is a parallel development in relation to gender, where the focus is more on gender identity and on internal experiences of gender, while in feminism, it was more about the gender as a social, the system of hierarchy as a social system. But I think these are very interrelated concepts, and this is how the working group understands it as well, because the gender is expressed internally, but it's formed within the society. But the way that in the different movements is used slightly differently, which opens up the concept, in my opinion, because it includes experiences of more people. In a way, it also complicated it, and it played well for the opposition to the term gender, and particularly in the context of the attacks on the so-called gender ideology that we have been witnessing since in 2000s as well, starting in 2010. And also the fact that the term is used slightly differently in the movements, by the different movements, has created certain frictions and tensions within the movements. And indeed, we have got complaints from different sides where certain people are afraid of erasure. And so where are we now, and how we can really work for unity, particularly when there is a context of attacks already, rather than friction and fights and exclusion. The Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, due to this context that I have just described, issued a position paper where we tried to say what our approach was. And our approach is this social constructionist approach to gender, as defined in CEDAW and the Istanbul Convention, etc. And for us, the key principle in our work is intersectionality and inclusion. So we as a mandate are concerned with all women, so all those who identify, including trans and those who identify as women. And we, in the tools that we have always tried to pay attention to the concerns of different groups of women, including lesbian, bi, and trans women. But we also note that the systems regulating sexuality and gender are also different but interrelated. As the ambassador mentioned, the patriarchy is the common denomination of oppression here. So, for example, so we have, as Victor has, as every special procedure has, 3 main tools at our disposal. One is the thematic reports, as is this one that Victor was speaking about. And in each of our thematic reports, we have always, to an extent possible, with such a diversity of women's experiences, try to look at how does the topic we are talking about applies to bisexual, lesbian, trans, and women, intersex women. And in family and culture, for example, we were recognizing how non-conforming, gender non-conforming women are vulnerable to criminalization, discrimination, and violence. We noted the diversity of families and asked for its recognition. In the report on health and safety, we talked how in the health context, there's a problem of humiliation when we talk about lesbian, bisexual, and trans women, and not only humiliation, but sometimes inhuman treatment. There we have actually specific part on issues related to sexual orientation and gender identity. Women deprived of liberty. In that report, we noted the vulnerability to criminalization, incarceration, and other forms of control of gender non-conforming individuals, and also sexually non-conforming. So this is some of the examples from the reports. We also conduct or have conducted country visits, and in all the reports, you can see something on issues related to SOGI, and we're always trying to include representatives of the different communities. So Moldova is such an example, Chile, Chad, but many other, Honduras, Romania, Poland, many other reports. And lastly, communications. We had quite a few communications, and we do that together with Victor, which dealt with the attacks on trans women or judicial harassment of trans women or lesbian women. We did a third-party intervention in the case of Semenya before the Court of Arbitration for Sport. We did a number of statements together with Victor, and I think I'm probably over time because I'm hearing something.
Thank you, Dr. Ivana.
Yeah, so I'm just going to conclude that I think that the way out is really cooperation.
Thank you again for highlighting again. This is our third speaker that talks about cooperation, about looking at similarities. And Dr. Ivana, I particularly want to thank you for sharing this historical snapshot in the use of the term gender, which can provide a lot of vision of how we can move forward and how to connect the different interpretations or the different usage that can be had and find that common ground. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
I'm going to switch to speaking Spanish. Nuestra siguiente panelista es Gloria Cariega Pérez. Gloria realizó sus estudios de licenciatura en psicología por el ITESO y de maestría en psicología social por la UNAM. Ella es cofundadora del programa universitario de estudios de género de la UNAM, donde fue secretaria académica de 1992 al 2004 y coordinó el área de estudios en sexualidades de 2015 al 2017. Actualmente continúa como docente en la Facultad de Psicología de la UNAM, de la que forma parte desde 1979. Gloria participa activamente en el movimiento feminista y en el movimiento LGBTI, tanto en la arena nacional como internacional. Fue cosecretaria general de la ILGA de 2008 a 2014 y directora del programa de sexualidad y VIH de la CNDH en 2019 y al 2020. Sus áreas de interés están centradas en los derechos humanos, el desarrollo y la sexualidad. Ha coordinado 11 antologías y publicado múltiples artículos y capítulos de libro. Gloria ha desarrollado estudios en el Centro Golda Meir en Israel y pasantías académicas de la UNA de Costa Rica y el SPW de Brasil. Ella ha sido distinguida con la medalla Omezigualt del Instituto de Mujeres del DF y el premio Hermelinda Galindo de la Comisión de Derechos Humanos del DF por su trabajo a favor de los derechos humanos. Gloria, es un placer que estés con nosotros el día de hoy. Tú has sido una lideresa en el movimiento LGBTI, no solo en México y en la región de América Latina, pero también a nivel global. Quisiera que compartieras con nosotros tu perspectiva de cuáles han sido los avances y desafíos históricos del movimiento. Gloria, por favor.
Muchas gracias, Erika. Y agradezco esta oportunidad que el gobierno de Holanda, Argentina y las distintas organizaciones que se han involucrado en la organización de este panel me dan para compartir con colegas y amigas como la embajadora Taxi, el experto Víctor, Ivana, Gita, Julia, una conversación necesaria en este momento y por demás enriquecedora en torno a los desafíos que hoy enfrentamos. Efectivamente, la oportunidad de haberme sumado a un movimiento global y formar parte del programa de estudios de género en la universidad me ha brindado la posibilidad de ampliar mis perspectivas, compartir con otros movimientos sociales y necesariamente desafiar mi propia estructura de pensamiento. Las políticas de género que se impulsaron desde la década de los 90 son resultado de un esfuerzo global feminista para incorporar la perspectiva de género que se había acuñado para una mejor comprensión de las condiciones de subordinación que las mujeres de distintos sectores enfrentaban en prácticamente todos los espacios de interacción social. La intención era precisamente develar aquellas prácticas que se habían no solo institucionalizado, sino naturalizado, lo que dificultaba incluso el reconocimiento por las propias mujeres. Su inclusión en un instrumento internacional garantizaba entonces la implementación de acciones de gobierno para un cambio paradigmático que alcanzara a las mujeres y a los hombres de todos los rincones en cada país. Como sabemos, con la evaluación que hemos hecho de las políticas instrumentadas en estos 25 años, no se han alcanzado las metas establecidas, pero probablemente con el giro que le ha dado hoy la Agenda 2030 se dé un nuevo impulso para seguir avanzando. En este sentido, los cuestionamientos que se han dado en los últimos años por los movimientos antigénero resultan criminales. Entiendo la dificultad para los grupos religiosos de ir más allá de los mandatos de sus libros sagrados que establecen precisamente una condición inamovible de subordinación para las mujeres. Una situación que enfrentamos desde la Conferencia del Cairo en 94 y en Beijing, aunque resulta inaceptable si hay muchos otros mandatos que se han ido ajustando a la realidad y a los preceptos de derechos humanos, como las lesiones, las injurias y mutilaciones que imponen ante ciertos actos. Pero parece que para cambiar la situación de las mujeres les resulta impensable. Mucho más difícil de comprender, por lo menos para mí, ha sido la postura, la reacción de algunos sectores feministas que se posicionan igualmente antigénero y más recientemente incluso contra la interseccionalidad, desconociendo aproximaciones teóricas fundamentales para el reconocimiento del lugar de la diversidad para la comprensión de la realidad. Es más, para el reconocimiento del papel de la diferencia y la diversidad como fundantes de la humanidad. Reconozco la dificultad para romper con el pensamiento binario que nos ha impuesto la cultura occidental, pero es un desafío que cada vez más se ha ido imponiendo ante la presencia activa de esta amplia diversidad cultural, social, sexual y de género. La condición que enfrentan las personas trans para todas nosotras no es desconocida. Sabemos que este binarismo no lo hace fácil, pero hemos vencido la ignorancia sobre la plasticidad del género, incluso desde nuestra propia experiencia al ser atacadas por las expresiones de género distintas, pero sobre todo a partir de los datos que nos dejan ver la exclusión y violencia que las personas trans enfrentan en distintos espacios desde etapas muy tempranas, afectando sus vidas, las posibilidades de participación y en general del desarrollo de todas sus capacidades y muchas veces lastimosamente al enfrentar distintas formas de violencia hasta el costo de sus vidas. La perspectiva de género nos ha permitido conocer cómo los hombres y las mujeres enfrentamos diferentes formas de discriminación y violencia por el entrecruzamiento de distintas dimensiones del sistema patriarcal de opresión. En ese sentido, jerarquizar el sufrimiento y vulnerabilidad con base en las diferencias de ninguna forma resuelve el problema. Solo revictimiza y limita la posibilidad de protección para algunos sectores. Reconocer esto es un punto de partida necesario para acabar con la desigualdad y la subordinación. Las lesbianas, desde el inicio de nuestra lucha, hemos establecido y mantenido un estrecho vínculo con el movimiento feminista. Y este movimiento ha sido un importante aliado para la lucha de los derechos LGBT. Desde ahí, hemos logrado la visibilidad y defensa de nuestros derechos al interior del movimiento LGBTI, pero juntas hemos impulsado cambios sociales que benefician a distintos sectores y a la sociedad toda. Es decir, la lucha del movimiento feminista es desde una perspectiva transformadora de la sociedad. Se ha confundido muchas veces el género con el ser mujer, pero el género es una dimensión que compartimos todas las personas. Nuestra presencia y la acción coordinada entre feministas y movimiento LGBT en espacios como las sesiones de la CSW, la interlocución con las expertas de la CEDAW, los acuerdos para definir las prioridades y estrategias en el Cairo como en Beijing, sin duda trajeron muy buenos resultados. Gracias a ese trabajo articulado, aún sin el reconocimiento de los derechos sexuales como tales, la discusión sobre la sexualidad y el género es mucho más frecuente y los derechos de las personas LGBT están presentes en prácticamente cada sesión del Consejo de Derechos Humanos.
Muchas gracias, Gloria. En verdad que podríamos escucharte todo un día por esta increíble cantidad de información que nos puedes compartir. Pero yo quiero resaltar algo que mencionaste, que a la vez a muchas ocasiones no hablamos y no los decimos bien claro. El movimiento antigénero puede resultar algo criminal. Eso es cierto. Así como también puede resultar criminal seguir en un sistema binario patriarcal. Y gracias por ser y traer estas opciones y estas pláticas a la mesa. Nuestra humanidad es enriquecida por nuestras diferencias, como vos mencionaste. Te quiero agradecer mucho, Gloria. Muchas gracias y espero que podamos responder y tengas unas preguntas más después en la sesión. Gracias. I'm going to switch back to English. Our next panelist, Geeta Misra, is the co-founder and executive director of CREA and has closely worked at the activist, grant-making, and policy levels on issues of sexuality, reproductive health, gender, human rights, and violence against women. She holds a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University and economics from Syracuse University. She is also a co-founder of Saki for South Asian Women in 1989, a nonprofit organization in New York committed to ending violence against women of South Asian origin. Formerly, Geeta has been the chair of the boards of Mama Cash and Awit, and she currently serves on the board of Estrella Lesbian Foundation for Justice and on Amnesty International's Task Force for Gender and Diversity. She is the author and editor of a number of publications, including Criminal Law, Activism, and Sexual and Reproductive Justice, and Sexuality, Gender, and Rights, Exploring Theory and Practice in South and Southeast Asia. Geeta, welcome. Your work with a feminist organization that has always supported trans rights, and I thank you for that. But what can you tell us about women's rights, inclusion, and intersectionality in the law, with everything around gender-based violence and the work around decriminalization? Geeta, please.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you, Ambassador Bahia, Victor, Ivana, Gloria, and Julia. It's always a pleasure to be on these panels where we bring our different perspectives, contexts, positions, and speak from those perspectives. So I'm speaking through the lens of CREA, a feminist human rights organization, where we are driven by twin foundational principles. One is what we believe that all people, irrespective of their status, have the inherent capacity to take responsibility for and make choices about their own lives. Second is that we believe that feminism asks us to transform ourselves while transforming the world. So CREA's interest in inclusion is deeply connected to our interest in both challenging exclusion wherever we see it, but also includes exclusion within feminist movements. So I wanted to give 3 examples of how CREA has approached and practiced inclusion, intersectionality, and foregrounding violence and harm and stigma around structurally excluded people. My first example is about the 377 campaign in India, which was an 8-year advocacy campaign to decriminalize homosexuality. It was called Voices Against 377 and was created as a broad coalition by advocating for the Supreme Court to read down Section 377 of India's Penal Code. The example of Voices Against 377 is interesting because unlike other contexts where activists advocated for decriminalization, especially by naming sexual orientation or LGBTQI people, Voices Against 377 sought to make a claim on decriminalizing consensual sex amongst adults, highlighting the right of every Indian to have consensual sex, right to equality before the law. It did not focus on natural sex. And the campaign decided to foreground the concept of sexual citizenship and disrupt popular notions of morality. We demanded the Supreme Court uphold constitutional morality, not public morality. Many other human rights groups saw 377 and through cross-movement dialogues and conversations, women's rights groups saw this claim as a protection against marital rape. Children's rights groups saw it as a protection against child sexual abuse. Sex worker rights groups were very appreciative of using consensual sex as a rubric for the claim. And I think what this campaign did was find a shared ground, a common platform for those of us working to dismantle the harm that had been caused by Section 377. Consent was this common ground. It gave the ability to bring everyone in. Our fight was about the fact that sexuality is part of everyone's life, and the decisions which the state makes about some people's sexuality actually affect everyone. This allowed us to create a bigger umbrella within which many kinds of people could see themselves reflected. My second example is about Kriya's effort to move women's rights advocates away from the concept of violence against women to gender-based violence. Even in recent years, a report to the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, mapping the effects of the COVID pandemic on gender-based violence, Kriya's report mounted an argument for why we use gender-based violence. We acknowledge that the framework of violence against women has been instrumental in women's movements advocacy to gain acknowledgement of the fact that women and girls are subject to multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and violence on the basis of the gender. But in our work, we soon had to confront the question of where do sex workers go when they face violence or are raped? What do we do when young boys are assaulted because they're perceived to be effeminate? What about violence and discrimination against trans and intersex people? The term gender-based violence provides us with the ability to frame experiences of violence more broadly and inclusively, allowing us to center those whose experiences of violence have gone unrecognized. It allows us to consider and understand violence against those who challenge the sex and gender binaries, such as trans, intersex, and non-binary people. It allows us to capture violence against those who may be seen as flouting traditional gender roles and norms, such as sex workers. At Kriya, when we talk about violence, we want to count people living with HIV, sex workers, trans, intersex, non-binary people, women with disabilities, people who are criminalized and incarcerated. These are often the women and people who are invisible in the data. But this is not about language anymore. Increasingly, we see the desire to cling to violence against women, often signals anti-gender and anti-rights forces at work in international and multilateral policy spaces, making it all the more important for us to keep pushing back, especially feminist organizations. We have now begun to use the language of structurally excluded people. My final example is our work on challenging criminalization, which gives us a new way to look at different groups of structurally excluded people to find a way and connect multiple strands of work. We have always worked with structurally excluded populations, including from feminist movements, LGBTQI people, sex workers, and women with disabilities. This gives us a lens to bring all these groups and more groups under a common call to action to challenge criminalization. We question and challenge carceral and punitive responses to violence, much of which is advocated for by feminists, while analyzing and understanding how criminal law consistently harms those who defy norms and those who are structurally excluded. We have to delve deeper into the troubled relationship feminists have long since had with criminal law, and we consider it our primary responsibility to convince feminists to move away from demanding punitive responses to violence and instead to approach GBV responses with the more holistic lens with a focus on justice and well-being. We have been able to bring together LGBTIQ advocates who are fighting penal codes in a number of countries and contexts which outlaw same-sex sex, or so-called cross-dressing laws, which are still used to punish gender non-conforming people and trans people. We bring sex workers to the table whose work is still criminalized in most countries. We have brought together folks who work on drug policy, those who work on prisons and incarceration on borders, and the criminalization of migration. We have brought together human rights defenders who are mapping and tracking how the criminal law is used to restrict civic space by incarcerating or punishing those who advocate for and demand human rights by curtailing expression and protest. So lastly, through these vibrant discussions, we are able to track and learn more about how anti-gender, anti-rights actors are consolidating power and using and deploying criminal law provisions to curtail movement work to advance gender and social justice. Our approach to inclusion is anchored by our approach to intersectionality. It is our experience and our understanding that women, men, or any other group are not a homogeneous group. Class, caste, race, ability, disability, ethnicity, type of work, immigration, status, and a number of other factors, and their confluence shape our experience of society, of hierarchy and power, and of human rights. Our understanding of intersectionality teaches us that it is not our anatomy that unites us. Indeed, many women are complicit in the oppression of other women and people across the lines of class, caste, race, etc. What unites us is our desire for a particular kind of world and a shared vision for the future. We don't have to all be in the same fight for the same thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geeta. And also I want to highlight the very last phrase you said. We don't all have to be in the same, fight, but it's important that we look at what unites us and that we have an emphasis on justice and well-being. Thank you very much. And thank you for sharing highlights of your report. I want to remind everyone that we have the opportunity to post questions in the Q&A box. But please be reminded that while you pose your questions, the use of respectful and inclusive language is absolute paramount in today's space. Thank you very much. We're going to go to our last panelist today. And after that, we're going to open the floor for questions and answers, which you have posted in the Q&A option. Julia Earth is the Director of Programs at ILGA World, where she develops ILGA World's programmatic work and manages the programs team. Before joining ILGA World, Julia was the Executive Director of Transgender Europe and has been central to the organization's growth and the development in its first decade. She served as a founding steering committee member of the International Trans Fund until 2019, is a board member of the Association for Women's Rights in Development, and a signatory to the Yogyakarta Principle +10. Julia holds a PhD in mathematics and lives with her partner and child in Berlin. Julia, in your work at ILGA and reflecting on what we have heard from previous panelists, what have you learned about what the trans community is currently facing? And what and how is ILGA addressing any of these issues? Please, Julia.
Thank you, Erica, for the kind introduction. I'm very honored to be speaking today at this side event, and I feel as a trans-identified woman, a lesbian, a mother, and a feminist, my various identities embrace the very essence of today's discussion. And I want to thank my fellow speakers, in particular Ambassador Bahia, Victor, and Ivana, for speaking with such passion on the alignment of sex, gender, and LGBTI issues. Gloria and Geeta, I feel humbled to be speaking alongside with you today. I had planned to start this intervention by speaking about some of my experiences in life, however, changed my mind yesterday. So I won't talk about how putting on a dress, coming out as a trans lesbian 2 decades ago, changed my view of the world, how I had to observe that people like me are invisibilized, how I became a target of discrimination and violence, and an object of ridicule and sometimes hate. I won't speak about that, because I'd rather show how anti-trans and anti-gender actors go to lengths in making their voice heard, and how those narratives join traditional conservative voices and creep into law and legal practice. But first, let me speak about the affirmation of feminist principles, one answer to Erica's initial question. The affirmation is a sign-on document for organizations and individuals alike. It narrates how feminist thinking, women's organizing, and LGBTI issues are aligned and fight for common goals: social justice and equality for all. It was drafted by a group of women, feminist, LGBTI, and trans organizations, and it speaks about core feminist principles as they relate to LGBTI issues. The document was born out of the analysis that while gender backlash is happening and anti-trans and anti-gender actors seem to have become louder and their arguments gaining more traction than before, the possibilities of organizations to publicly demonstrate their alignment with core feminist values was just not there. 400 organizations and almost 1,200 individuals have signed the declaration since its publication last week. And as expressed already, the affirmation takes departure in the analysis that women's liberation, feminist thinking, and LGBTI persons' human rights not only share common grounds, common values, and in fact have the same opponents, but the affirmation as well takes departure in the fact that violence and discrimination on grounds of sex, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics. And yes, we need all of them. And it is as well not one or the other, but all. So all of these have a common root cause. The way how our societies perceive sex and gender. Or to be more precise, the assumption that sex is binary and based on a person's sex characteristic, and that this said sex again gives rise to an immutable gender, which again is binary and leads to gendered expectations towards the individuals throughout all of our lives. In this system, roles of women are less autonomous, less independent, and economically underprivileged. And at the same time, everyone who questions or transgresses those gendered expectations and stereotypes, be it women and or LGBTI people, will be subjected to discrimination and violence. It reinforces patriarchy and solidifies unjust division of power and access to resources within and among our societies. And this is why feminist, women, and LGBTI activism becomes one. There is no either or. One just has to take a step back and see the bigger systemic picture. Now let us move on and analyze some of our opponents' tactics. Among the 1,400 individual signatories to the declaration received, we had to identify more than 200 as clearly hostile. The majority of them were anti-trans and anti-gender messages. Some were homophobic, and a handful were misogynist. This is, of course, not a singular event, but shows a pattern that we could observe already multiple times. Victor has reported about this in his submissions to the current report. The Yogyakarta Principles +10, which take departure in a feminist analysis, have triggered similar opposing reactions, and many colleagues in our field have been targeted by gender backlash as well as anti-gender and anti-trans actors. You could argue that these are only few people, which are very loud. However, the Vicky Hernandez case at the Inter-American Court tells us otherwise and shows the danger that lies in those narratives. For those who are not familiar with the case, Vicky Hernandez was a trans woman in Honduras, a sex worker and a defender of rights of trans people who was killed by law enforcement officials. Her case made it to the Inter-American Court. The verdict of the court was quite positive. However, the president of the court and the only woman on the bench noted the dissenting opinion. She argued that Vicky Hernandez would not fall under the protection of what is referred to as the Belém do Pará Convention, as the court had held, because that convention was only protecting from violence on grounds of biological sex. This is in clear contradiction to the interpretation of said convention to date. However, this is exactly how anti-trans narratives creep into law and find traction with a conservative mainstream. Because, of course, her dissenting opinion was joined by a fellow conservative judge. So I would love to unpack all of this. Of course, I cannot due to time restrictions. Therefore, let me conclude my intervention by sharing some additional observations in that regard. Anti-trans and anti-gender actors strategically single out trans issues in order to attack both LGBTI movements and feminist actors in an attempt to divide our movements. They fuel arguments of the more traditional anti-feminist, misogynist, conservative, and anti-rights actors, and find traction among a conservative mainstream that opposes gender equality and women's rights. The way, third, how those messages are framed denies trans people their right to identity and denies their existence. Not only that, they often as well induce fear among women and portray women as victims of trans perpetrators and victims of oppression and violence, not exactly an empowering approach. For trans activists, those narratives are often triggering and hard to digest. They impact us personally and make it hard to react strategically and not out of anger, hurt, or rage. And this brings me to my concluding point. I believe the strength of our argument lies not only in the fact that they root in human rights, but that our methods of work uphold our values, including solidarity and collaboration. That is our strength. No matter what we do, we never may lose sight of living, breathing, and upholding these values. And I don't think no one has put that in words better than Michelle Obama when she said, when they go low, we go high. And that is why I'm saying today, I hold my head up high today, and I, a trans feminist lesbian mother, I exist. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you for those very powerful words. And of course, you hold your head high, and we are all there with you. So I'm gonna open the question and answer section. We have received multiple questions from participants. They have not been directed to anyone in particular, to any one of the panelists. So what I want to do right now is invite all the panelists to open your video and feel free to answer a question whenever you think you can provide an answer. So let's start with the first question. We have seen vocal opposition to gender theory by a few but vocal groups, often ones that also claim to be feminists. Gender theory shows the common links and core of women's rights and LGBTI rights, with a common enemy of patriarchy. Why isn't this resonating with these groups? What is stuck? Does anyone want to provide some insight? Any of the panelists wants to share? Dr. Ivana, perhaps you mentioned something that is similar in this area about the history of feminism.
No, I just mentioned that it seems that some of these constituencies are afraid of erasure, are afraid of who hold these views, and I think it is important to try to engage in conversation and to hear the arguments. And we did get some submissions as well. And one is that the use of the term woman. The other one is like whether the woman as a category in a way it's gonna disappear. But I really don't think I'm the person to answer. But for me, I think it's really a matter to try really to be inclusive and not for all the groups. And I also think it's not only feminist versus, or parts of the feminist versus LGBT. I think there's frictions between the LGBT or L and T versus sometimes as well. So what I think that we as human rights defenders, sometimes we tend to, and it's important that we understand the oppression which is really where we are situated, which is for some based on sex or gender identity or all and sexual orientation, etc. But I think we need to really open ourselves more to the complexities of the worlds and not to have the Olympics of oppression, as sometimes I call it, which I see in human rights world sometimes, that everybody just thinks about their own issue. And we really need to understand our interconnectedness, and that if we are all not allowed to feel, safe, to feel that we can express ourselves whichever way we wish to express ourselves, and while not harming others, of course, then I think we need to, in order to be a healthy society, we need to start with that, and we need to stop thinking that everything is threatening, that the expression of another human, for whichever reasons, and you can see it here, it's gender identity, in some other areas it's abortion, in the other area, there's always something. But like, can we start seeing each other as so interconnected that if one is not good and feeling well, the other one is also not going to feel well.
Thank you very much.
Well.
Thank you very much, Ivana. Victor, I see you have your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Erika, and thanks for Ivana for kind of getting the discussion going and for this question as well. Let me try to contribute with a couple of ideas, but first, let me very, very transparently say that my ideas as an independent expert that I am, sometimes are the collective of a number of inputs that I've received throughout this process. So if any of you, any of the extraordinary individuals that are in this call sees yourself reflected in them, please know that it's because I'm in the process of gathering all of this. So 3 points very quickly, Erika, that I'd like to make in relation to this. First, one of the complexities that we need to acknowledge is that the narratives and the limitations of language and across languages are very, very significant in relation to this issue. And there is not only one concept of gender ideology, for example. Gender ideology has been described as a symbolic vessel, actually able to capture issues and fights as dissimilar as grievances against equal marriage, comprehensive sexual education, voluntary termination of pregnancy, gender identity recognition, and so on and so forth. So, of course, when we are talking about persons who are holding a particular, let's say, anti-gender stance, it would be really important to get into that debate that Ivana was describing, to say exactly what is the ultimate grievance and what is the actual worry that exists in that person, which in some cases, we must admit may be originated in a human rights concern of some sort or the other. That's one thing. Having said that, we also must, as we know, acknowledge that some agendas are regressive in nature. Some agendas are tending not only to use these concepts and to instill fear, and in particular, appeal to the worst fears of persons, and to create sensationalistic understandings of the risks that occur. This is, for example, what is happening and what we see happening in deeply stigmatizing ideas about the risks that trans women represent to safe spaces or to sports. None of those arguments appear to be based on evidence that actually demonstrate any statistical realities. I mentioned this in my report as well, but they are deeply ingrained in narratives that actually appeal to people's primal fears that are difficult to debate over Twitter, for example. The limitations of characters on Twitter is a big limitation to the way we talk nowadays, Erika. I would place in that context the expressions of Judge Olio Benito that Julia was making reference to. Her dissenting opinion, I respectfully, but very profoundly disagree with. And she speaks of a certain notion of vertigo in relation to this deconstruction of the binary and these developments. And I think it's important to acknowledge that this vertigo does exist and that we actually need to engage in facts-based provision so as to ensure that this is not hindering the efforts. And that's my second point. And very quickly, a third point. Having said that, having acknowledged the possibility that we need to work together to understand where objective real risk exists and to assess that and to dispel the enormity of myths and fears and stigma, we also need to ensure that we act with lots of respect to people. And respect also means making people responsible for their actions. People who are acting in this anti-rights, anti-gender movement are creating consequences. And those consequences can be addressed through institutions and constructions such as hate speech, for which a very vigorous framework exists under United Nations mechanism, and also hate crimes, which is an obligation of states. I think all of this gives us a notion of the complexity, but also the way that, as Gloria, as Gita, as Julia were saying, we need to collaborate in taking forward this work in understanding that it is the joint agenda to ensure rights for all and not rights only for a hierarchy of suffering, as was so aptly put by our dear Gloria. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor. Julia, really fast so that we can move to another question.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. I want to pick up Victor's third and first point, the need to collaborate and to unpack the grievances that are brought forward. Because both, I think, are the basis for building bridges and eventually working together on a shared goal. And I think some of the grievances include a fear among some women's groups that gender identity will take precedence over sex-based discrimination. And of course, that is as well fueled by certain actors. And I think the main point as well of my intervention earlier today was to say that this is not an either or. I think it always needs to be an and. The point of protecting on grounds of gender identity is not to get rid of sex-based discrimination. The point is to add to the whole to the whole concept and make it more holistic and applicable to just more persons. And I think human rights is not it's not a limited resource that we need to fight over. In fact, we can mutually, aggravate and add to each other if we take the approach of dialogue and listening to each other seriously.
Thank you very much, Julia. And I know we're closely reaching the end of our time together. So I want to pose one question to all our panelists, and you in 1 or a minute and a half provide some input. Historically, our society, human beings are characterized by a lot of emphasis in what is different. We have seen it in epidemics. We have seen it in human rights movement. We have seen it in democracies, every time building and separating what makes us different. How can we take that leap? And like Julia said, how do we build those bridges to stop that huge emphasis in differences and look at our commonalities, which all of you have mentioned, of what we need to work together. So what are the next steps for this discussion? What can the feminist, women's, and LGBTI movements do together in the coming months and years to take this forward? And I want to hear from all of you really quickly. What are your thoughts so that we close with this? Dr. Ivana, you can go first.
You decided I was going to be the first every
Yes.
time. Problems need to speak better and really to speak, to listen, I wanted to say. So in whichever movement, feminist or LGBT, and it's so difficult even to speak these movements as if separate, because there is so many overlaps, and we need to listen to try to understand really, and I think we are already so the parts that have problems have the talk that is respectful, as Victor said, because it often comes into labeling and problematic hurtful speech. And on the other hand, what is happening, the events like this, or all the activities that we are already doing, that Kriya is doing, that Victor is doing, that we are doing, I think there's so much already going on that we need to continue working as an example, I think.
Thank you, Ivana. Gloria, muy rapidita porque se nos acaba el tiempo. ¿Qué podríamos hacer juntos en los siguientes meses o años para avanzar?
Yo creo que es necesario romper con esta idea de las jerarquías con la construcción de estas otredades. Es decir, las narrativas y las acciones contra el género y el reconocimiento de las interseccionalidades implican un grave retroceso para la lucha de los derechos humanos y genera un clima desfavorable para el reconocimiento mismo de los aportes y de la lucha del movimiento feminista. Posicionarnos contra los derechos de las personas trans atenta contra lo que por tantos años se ha construido en la teoría feminista. Necesitamos reflexionar de nuevo, reconocer que el género y la sexualidad son dos dimensiones que se entrecruzan y definen la identidad de todas las personas. No podemos ignorar esto. Me parece que tenemos que encontrar espacios de reflexión, de construcción colectiva, que rompa precisamente con estos temores que se han generado con respecto a la parcialización de los derechos que ya mencionaba Julia, ¿no? Creo que todos tenemos derechos y no podemos distanciarnos de los principios que sustentan todos los derechos para todas, porque sabemos que limitar el derecho de algunos va a afectarnos a todas las personas.
Muchas gracias, Gloria. Gita, what are your recommendations of what we need to do together in the next few months
I
and
think,
year?
Yeah, people have already mentioned cross-conversation, convening, I think learning and unlearning. But I think from where I sit, a lot of feminist organizations need to work much more on sexuality issues. That's where we will be able to get to this tolerance of difference, diversity, see how common things like violence, police harassment, stigma, discrimination apply to different groups of people, but also not feminists really have to push themselves to not think of homogeneous identity-based groups. Like Julia said, there are many cross ways of defining oneself. And I would say the last thing would be to think about human rights standards such as consent for sexual legitimacy that address violence across these groups. It takes time, and it takes a lot of deep listening, conversation, and studying the complexity, and really not allowing the anti-gender people and the commonality of who's opposing, like who are you sitting in solidarity with? Is that what you want? And I think the example from India and 377 really gives us a lot of hope around these fault lines of feminist movements and other movements coming up with common goals, common vision for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gita. Julia, your input.
Thank you. I think Gita said it in the beginning that feminism is as well about questioning ourselves. It's about unlearning internalized patterns of oppression in ourselves. And I think to your question, in order to do that, in order to understand other persons, as Gita and Gloria as well have said, to come to a common ground, we need to not only listen, but leave our comfort zone and make an effort in order to understand the validity of the experience of others, even if they contradict our own thoughts and beliefs. And I think that is painful, but necessary in order to advance.
Thank you very much, Julia. Victor, closing remarks.
Thank you, Erica. I would just echo the words of the very distinguished women that have spoken already. I would say that the key word is respect. Respect leads to trust. Trust is the space where we actually build together. I believe that the critical mass of people who are working in this field will be geared towards the right solution, which is a world of justice, equality, and freedom. To achieve that, respect is the first step.
Thank you very much, Victor. I want to thank everybody, most importantly, the participants who joined us today. While we might not all agree on everything, the fact that all of you took time to listen to us today is already the beginning on how we will work together in the future. Thank you, Ambassador Bahia, Victor, Julia, Gloria, Ivana, and Gita, to our co-sponsor, the Netherlands and Argentina, interpreters, the persons who work in closed captioning and sign language, and all the support from ILGA staff that made this webinar possible. Thank you very much. Have a great day wherever you are.